There's this moment that happens in meetings sometimes. Someone says something that crosses a line. Nothing dramatic enough to report to HR. Just one of those comments that lands wrong, that makes your stomach tight, that makes you suddenly aware of how small you feel in that chair. And everyone keeps talking like nothing happened. Like you're supposed to just absorb it and move on. And you do. You smile. You nod. You participate in the next agenda item. But inside there's this voice screaming, I want to be able to leave. Not storm out. Not make a scene. Just leave. Walk away from situations that make me feel this small. Have enough money that I never have to sit through another moment like this just because I need the paycheck. That's the kind of rich I want to be. Not the kind with designer bags or luxury cars. The kind who can say, this isn't working for me, and mean it. The kind who doesn't have to calculate rent and groceries and health insurance before deciding whether to protect their peace. This really crystallized for me about 3 months ago. I was having dinner with my parents, just a regular Sunday thing, and my dad asked how work was going. And I did what I always do. I gave him the sanitized version. Busy, you know. Some interesting projects. The usual challenges. But the truth was, work had been eroding something in me for months. My manager had this way of giving feedback that felt less like guidance and more like a systematic dismantling of my confidence. Little comments about my tone in meetings. Questions about whether I was really committed when I left at 6 instead of staying until 8. This pattern of making me feel like I was always falling just short of acceptable. And I couldn't tell my dad this because I knew what he'd say. He'd tell me that all jobs have difficult people. That you have to develop thick skin. That this is just how the working world is. And he wouldn't be wrong exactly. But he also wouldn't understand that I wasn't asking for it to be easy. I was just tired of measuring my worth by my ability to endure things that make me feel small. After dinner, I drove home and I started doing this mental math I've done 1,000 times. How much money would I need to have the option to quit? Not to quit immediately. Just to have quitting be a real choice instead of a fantasy. To be able to say, this environment isn't healthy for me, without it being a financial disaster. I pulled up my banking app at a red light and stared at my savings account. It was decent. Better than a lot of people my age. But it wasn't walk away from a bad situation money. It was cover an emergency money. And those are completely different things. Because here's what I realized sitting at that red light. I'd been doing everything right according to the conventional script. I had a good job. I was contributing to retirement. I was being financially responsible. But I'd somehow ended up in this trap where my responsibility had become another form of imprisonment. Where doing the right thing meant staying in situations that were slowly making me into a smaller, quieter version of myself. I started thinking about all the times I'd stayed somewhere too long. The friendship that had turned toxic, but I couldn't walk away because we had the same friend group and leaving would mean losing everyone. The living situation with roommates who made me anxious in my own home, but I couldn't afford to break the lease and move. The relationship where I knew we weren't right for each other, but I'd signed a year lease with them and felt trapped by logistics and money. Money kept being the reason I couldn't leave. Not the only reason, but the reason that made all the other reasons stick. The anchor that kept me in places I'd outgrown or situations that were actively hurting me. And I started noticing this pattern everywhere. I'd see people at work who were clearly miserable, but they had mortgages and kids and their whole life was structured around this specific income level. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to. They'd built a life that required them to stay, and now staying was the only option that made sense financially. Or I talked to friends who'd mention in passing that they'd love to travel or try a different career or move to a different city, but then they'd immediately follow it up with all the reasons why they couldn't. And most of those reasons came down to money. Not having enough saved. Not being able to afford the gap in income. Not being willing to risk the stability they'd worked so hard to build. We were all living these lives where we'd traded freedom for security, and now we couldn't remember what freedom felt like. We'd gotten so used to calculating the financial cost of every decision that we'd stopped asking whether the decisions were actually what we wanted. I thought about my coworker who'd been trying to leave our company for 2 years but kept getting headhunted for similar roles that paid about the same. She needed a significant pay increase to make the disruption worth it because she had student loans and credit card debt and this whole financial structure that meant she couldn't afford to take a lateral move even if it would make her happier. The money had to keep going up. That was the only acceptable direction. And I realized I was heading down that same path. I was already making decisions based on money rather than meaning. Already turning down opportunities because they didn't pay enough. Already measuring every option against my current salary. Already building a life that would require me to keep earning this much or more forever. There was this moment in my car where I felt this deep, almost physical claustrophobia. Like I could see my entire future laid out and it was just more of this. More jobs I couldn't afford to leave. More situations I'd have to endure. More relationships and friendships and living situations where I'd make myself smaller to keep the peace because the alternative was financial chaos. I thought about the people I knew who seemed genuinely free. And they weren't the ones with the most impressive jobs or the biggest houses. They were the ones who'd somehow managed to build lives that gave them options. Who had enough saved or earned enough or lived simply enough that they could make choices based on something other than pure financial survival. One of my friends had recently quit a job that was making her anxious and depressed. Just quit without another job lined up. And everyone treated her like she'd done something reckless and irresponsible. But she'd been saving for 3 years specifically to give herself the option to leave if she needed to. She'd been living well below her means, turning down expensive dinners and trips, and everyone thought she was being cheap. But really she was buying herself freedom. She was building an exit fund. And sitting in my car that night, I realized that's what I wanted. Not a luxury fund. An exit fund. Enough money that "this isn't working for me" could be a complete sentence. Enough savings that I could walk away from things that were hurting me without having to immediately replace them with something else that might hurt me in different ways. But when I tried to talk about this with people, I got weird reactions. When I mentioned wanting to build up savings so I could have more freedom to leave bad situations, they'd hear it as me being ungrateful or not committed or always looking for the easy way out. Like wanting the option to leave meant I wasn't willing to work through difficulties. But that wasn't it at all. I wasn't trying to avoid all discomfort or run away at the first sign of challenge. I just wanted to be able to distinguish between growth-edge discomfort and harm-inducing discomfort. And I wanted the financial freedom to exit the latter without destroying my life. Maybe you feel this too. Maybe you've been sitting in situations that don't fit anymore, doing the math in your head, trying to figure out how long you'd have to stay before leaving became financially viable. Maybe you've been telling yourself that wanting money for freedom instead of stuff makes you different, but then feeling guilty because isn't wanting money always supposed to be about greed? Here's something we don't talk about enough. Poverty isn't just about not having things. It's about not having choices. It's about your options being determined by your bank account rather than your values or your well-being or your sense of what's right for you. And you don't have to be in actual poverty to experience this. You can have a good job and health insurance and a decent apartment and still feel trapped by money. Still feel like every decision comes down to what you can afford rather than what you actually want. We're taught to think of wealth in terms of accumulation. More stuff, bigger house, nicer car, luxury experiences. And if you say you want to be wealthy, that's what people assume you mean. They assume you're chasing status or comfort or the ability to impress people. But there's this whole other dimension of wealth that nobody talks about. Wealth as optionality. Wealth as the power to exit. Wealth as the ability to say no without consequences. That kind of wealth doesn't look like anything from the outside. It doesn't show up in your Instagram feed. It doesn't announce itself at parties. It just sits quietly in your bank account, changing the entire shape of your life by changing what you're willing to tolerate. And when you're chasing that kind of wealth, you can't really talk about it. Because if you say, I want to be rich, people hear expensive tastes and materialism. If you say, I want financial freedom, it sounds like some hustle culture fantasy. If you say, I want enough money that I can leave situations that hurt me, people tell you that's just called having boundaries, as if boundaries work the same way when you're financially dependent on the thing you're trying to boundary. So you stop talking about it. You stop trying to explain that you're not motivated by greed or status or even traditional success. You're motivated by the desire to never again have to smile through something that makes you feel small just because you need the money. You're motivated by the fantasy of being able to care for yourself without having to calculate the cost first. But the silence around this creates its own kind of isolation. Because you're watching everyone else chase the visible markers of success while you're chasing something that's functionally invisible. You're watching people compete for promotions and bigger salaries so they can buy bigger houses, and you're thinking about how a bigger house just means a bigger mortgage, which means more golden handcuffs, which means less freedom to leave if things go wrong. You're watching people celebrate job offers based purely on salary, and you're thinking about all the invisible costs. The commute that will exhaust them, the culture that might grind them down, the boss who might make them miserable. And you're wondering why we only calculate the financial math and never the freedom math. Why we measure opportunities by what they pay and not by what they cost us in terms of autonomy and choice. And maybe you've started to feel like you're the only one who sees it this way. Like everyone else is playing a game where the goal is to earn more and spend more and build a bigger, more impressive life. While you're trying to figure out how to build a life that gives you the option to leave parts of it behind if they stop serving you. The cruel part is that the system is designed to keep you trapped. The more successful you become in traditional terms, the more expensive your life gets. The more you earn, the more you spend. Lifestyle inflation isn't just about wanting nicer things. It's about your entire life expanding to match your income. Your friends start making plans that cost more. Your neighborhood gets more expensive. Your sense of what's normal shifts. And suddenly you're making 3 times what you made 5 years ago, but you're not any more free. You're actually less free because now you have more to lose. More obligations. More people depending on your income. More monthly payments. More reasons you can't afford to take a risk or make a change or walk away from something that's slowly killing your spirit. You wanted money so you could have options, but somehow the money just created more constraints. More reasons to stay. More things holding you in place. And nobody warns you about this. Nobody tells you that climbing the ladder doesn't automatically give you the freedom to step off it. That earning more doesn't necessarily mean having more choices. That you can be financially successful and still feel trapped. So you're stuck in this paradox. You need money to have freedom, but pursuing money in traditional ways often means sacrificing freedom. You want the option to leave, but building that option seems to require staying in places you want to leave. You want to protect your peace, but protecting your peace costs money you can only make by sacrificing your peace. And underneath all of this is a deeper fear that maybe you don't actually talk about. The fear that you'll spend your whole life chasing financial security, doing all the right things, making all the responsible choices, and you'll still never feel free. You'll still be calculating whether you can afford to leave. You'll still be trapped by money, just at a higher income level. Because here's the truth. There's no amount of money that automatically gives you permission to prioritize yourself. That's not a financial threshold. That's a psychological one. And maybe what you're really chasing isn't a number in your bank account. Maybe you're chasing the internal permission to value your well-being over your productivity. To choose peace over success. To leave things that hurt you even when leaving means losing something. So, I mentioned that dinner with my parents, right? Well, about a week after that, I was helping my mom clean out their garage. Just sorting through old boxes, deciding what to keep and what to donate. And I found this folder of financial documents from when they first got married. I wasn't trying to snoop. The folder was just there, mixed in with old photos and papers. But I saw my dad's salary from his first job out of college. And I did the math, adjusted for inflation. And it hit me like a physical thing. He was making less than I am now. Significantly less. With a wife and a baby on the way. In a city with a cost of living that wasn't that different from mine. And I thought about all the times I'd heard him tell me to toughen up. To stick it out. To deal with difficult bosses and frustrating situations. And I'd always heard it as him not understanding. As him being from a different generation that just accepted suffering as part of work. But what if it wasn't that? What if he knew exactly what I was feeling? What if he'd spent decades wanting to leave and never being able to? What if all his advice about sticking it out wasn't wisdom but resignation? I sat there in that garage holding this old pay stub and I felt something shift. My dad wasn't less aware than me. He wasn't more willing to tolerate bad situations. He just never had the option to leave. Not really. He had a family depending on him and a salary that barely covered expenses and no safety net. Leaving wasn't a choice he could consider. So he learned to stop considering it. And suddenly all those Sunday dinners felt different. All those conversations where I'd felt like he didn't get it. Maybe he got it more than anyone. Maybe he'd spent 40 years doing exactly what I was trying to avoid. Staying in situations that made him smaller because staying was the only financially viable option. And now he was watching me struggle with the same thing, knowing exactly how it felt, knowing exactly where it led. I went home that night and I couldn't stop thinking about it. About how many people are walking around with this same quiet desperation. This same desire to leave situations that hurt them, combined with the financial reality that leaving isn't possible. About how we've built an entire economy that depends on people feeling too trapped to walk away. And then something else occurred to me. I started thinking about my friend who'd quit her job, the one everyone called irresponsible. The one who'd been saving for 3 years to give herself options. And I realized I'd been judging her too. Not out loud but in my head. Part of me had thought she was being dramatic. That she should have just dealt with the job stress like everyone else. That walking away was a luxury. But she wasn't being dramatic. She was being free. She'd looked at her life and decided that she'd rather have less money and more autonomy than more money and no way out. She'd actually done the thing I was fantasizing about. She'd built her life in a way that gave her options. And instead of celebrating that, I'd been quietly critical because her choice made me aware of my own lack of choices. The hard truth was that I'd been playing it safe, making the responsible choices, building the stable life. And in the process I'd built a cage. A comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. And my friend had been willing to live with less comfort to maintain more freedom. She'd made a trade-off I wasn't brave enough to make. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable. I started looking at my spending habits differently. All the things I told myself I needed. The nice apartment in the expensive neighborhood. The car payment. The streaming services and gym membership and regular meals out. The weekend trips and concert tickets and new clothes every season. I wasn't spending on luxury. I was solidly middle class. But I was spending right up to my income. And every purchase was another thread tying me to my current salary. Another reason I couldn't afford to make less. Another justification for staying in situations I wanted to leave. I'd been blaming the system for trapping me while actively participating in my own entrapment. I'd been saying I wanted freedom while making choices that required increasing amounts of money to sustain. I'd been claiming I wanted options while building a life that left me with none. And the most painful realization was this. I wasn't actually willing to make the trade-offs that freedom required. I wanted the financial freedom to leave, but I also wanted the nice apartment and the social life and the comfort level I'd grown accustomed to. I wanted options without sacrifice. I wanted freedom without actually being willing to live the kind of life that creates freedom. My friend had made a different choice. She'd lived in a tiny studio when she could have afforded more. She'd said no to trips and dinners and experiences that everyone else was having. She'd been willing to be the cheap one, the boring one, the one who never went out. And in return, she built a life where she wasn't trapped, where she could leave when something wasn't right for her. I hadn't been willing to do that. I'd been unwilling to be different, unwilling to live below my means in a visible way, unwilling to miss out on experiences my friends were having. And now I was paying the price in freedom. The wealth I'd been chasing wasn't actually about having more money. It was about being willing to need less. About building a life that wasn't dependent on maximum income. About creating real, actual freedom instead of just fantasizing about it. So here's where I am now. I'm not going to tell you I quit my job or made some dramatic change. I didn't. But I did start asking myself different questions. Not, how can I earn enough to have the option to leave? But, what am I willing to sacrifice to create that option? Because I think a lot of us are in the same place. We want freedom, but we're not willing to live like we want freedom. We want options, but we're not willing to build the kind of life that creates options. We want money to give us power, but we're not willing to need less money, which is actually where the power comes from. And I'm still figuring this out. I'm still scared of making the wrong choice. Still worried about falling behind. Still tempted to just keep climbing the ladder and hoping it eventually leads to freedom. But I'm starting to understand that freedom isn't a destination you reach by earning enough. It's something you build by being willing to need less. By being willing to be different. By being willing to trade comfort for autonomy. Write me a comment about what you'd walk away from if money wasn't an issue. Not the dramatic stuff. The everyday situations that you stay in because leaving would cost too much. The job that's slowly grinding you down. The living situation that makes you anxious. The relationship that stopped being right for you months ago. Name the thing you'd leave if you could. And if this hit home for you, if you've been sitting in situations you want to leave while doing the math in your head trying to figure out when you can afford to go, hit that like button. Let's be real about the fact that we're all carrying this. Tell me in the comments about the trade-offs you've made or haven't been willing to make. Have you chosen comfort over freedom? Security over options? Are you willing to live differently to build a different kind of life? Or are you, like me, still trying to figure out if freedom is actually worth what it costs? Because I think we need to talk about this more honestly. We need to stop pretending that the solution is just earning more money. Sometimes it is. But sometimes the solution is being willing to need less. Being willing to build a life that gives you room to breathe. Being willing to be different from everyone around you if that's what it takes to protect your peace. Let's build a space here in the comments where we can admit that we feel trapped. That we're staying in situations we want to leave because we don't see another financially viable option. That we're not sure how to build lives that give us the freedom we're craving. That we're tired of measuring every decision against our bank account. And if you know someone who's been talking about wanting to leave something but feeling stuck, send this to them. Not as pressure, but as a reminder that they're not alone in feeling this tension between wanting freedom and feeling trapped by financial reality. That we're all trying to figure out how to build lives that let us leave when we need to. Maybe we start by being honest about what freedom actually costs. About the trade-offs we're willing to make and the ones we're not. About the gap between what we say we want and how we're actually living. About the fact that wanting money so you can leave isn't shallow or selfish. It's just human. It's wanting dignity and choice and the power to protect yourself. And maybe that honesty is where real change begins. Not in earning more but in needing less. Not in climbing higher but in building wider. Not in having more money but in giving money less power over our choices. In building lives that let us leave when we need to, because that option, that freedom, is worth more than any amount of stuff.